Let's learn how to create a Codespace for our Maven project. The fastest way to get there is by clicking this green button and then clicking on Create Codespace on main. Now you can create it on any branch that you want. For our specific needs, we're going to create it on the main branch. Now, Codespace is just a development container that's running on a remote virtual machine. So what we're seeing is Visual Studio Code being hosted by that virtual machine and accessible through this URL up here. This makes it possible for us to basically use anything that VS Code offers for you inside of your development environment. By default, your Codespace will contain a bunch of different languages and running environments. So you could develop in Node, you could develop in Java, Python, a bunch of different languages. It also comes with some default tools like Gradle or Maven, wget, OpenSSH, Nano, all of these different tools that you can use inside of your development environment. So once you create your Codespace and open it up, you actually get some options, some things pop up. It's asking us to install the extension pack for Java, which it notices that we're using Maven. So it's like, hey, let's install this extension pack automatically for you. Now, if you want to just get going, get up and running, you can just click on this install button and go ahead and start working on your Java app. Now you'll notice by default, if we run Java-version, we get this OpenJDK version 11, which if we open up our pom.xml, we'll see that we actually have version 17 as our source and target. So even though by default we have Java installed, we may not have the correct JDK that we want to use for our application. Now, what's nice about the extension is it gives you a way to install the JDK, but here's the kicker. The JDK is being installed on your machine. Because this is just a visual representation of the VS Code dev container that's currently running on the VM, it's going to have you download the JDK to your computer, which you can't do anything with because you're not actually on the virtual machine. We can't install something directly to this machine. So the extension is nice when we're developing, but this welcome screen doesn't give us anything. In order to create the dev container with the correct JDK, we have to use a dev container configuration file that sets up all of the JDK information as well as all of the tools and things that we want to use inside of our container. So let's get to configuring our container. If we go to the bottom left, we can click on this big button down here that says Codespaces and then the name of our Codespace. From here, it opens up the command palette. Now we can select Add Dev Container Configuration Files. Now it knows that we don't actually have an active configuration. We just have the default one. So what we can do is create a new configuration. I'll select that. Now from here, it gives us all different dev containers that we can choose from, but I want to show all definitions. Now I know specifically I want to create a Java container, so I'll start typing Java, and the first option is the one that I want. Now there are some other things that you could add to it, like PostgreSQL or potentially TypeScript and stuff like that, but I know particularly for my applications, just using Java. So once I hit enter, I have the ability to select which JDK that I want to use, and for me, I'll just allow it to use the default 21 Bullseye. Now I know that I'm using Maven, so I'm going to select Maven and then hit enter. So here I can add any additional features, and these could be anything. I could be adding a tool like Android SDK or something like Ant, and allows me to pick and choose any features that I really need for my development. So I'll go ahead and select Android SDK so I can show you what happens in the configuration file. Now we can configure these features any way that we want, but I'm just going to keep the defaults. So once you finish the dev container wizard, over here on the left, there will be a new folder that is the .dev container, and underneath that will be the dev container.json, which is our configuration. We also get a notification down here in the bottom right that asks us to rebuild because it notices that we have a new configuration inside of the Codespace. Before we rebuild though, I want to go through each option inside of the configuration file so that I can tell you what it's doing. The first thing is the name, and you can change this to anything that you want, whatever you want this dev container to be called. The next thing is the image, and this will be the container that we are cloning from. So we're selecting that Java 21 Bullseye container from GitHub's own container registry, and we're going to clone it and then create everything else inside of it. We could also change out this image for a Docker file or a Docker Compose file that allows us to create more granular configuration that we want for the dev container. The next options are the features, and these will be all of the tools that we want to install. So you can see that we have this Java feature and we're installing Maven set to true. We're not installing Gradle, and we don't have a version. The next feature is the Android SDK that we decided to install as well. And it has options too, but we just kept the defaults, which are our empty configurations. Now, there are a few things commented out below this. One is forward ports. This will be if we need to forward ports to our local machine, we can list them in this array. The next is post create command, and this does exactly what you'd expect it to. It runs a command in the terminal after the Codespace has been created. The third is customizations, and this allows us to customize the VS Code environment or the environment of any other tools that we're using. The last commented out option is the remote user, and this just allows us to change to the root user if we want to. We don't really need to change the forward ports, but I will change the post create command. I'll uncomment this, and I'll leave the command at java-version just so that we can see in the output what version of Java that we're using. I'll also uncomment the customizations, and I'll delete this comma because we're not going to change to the remote user. And inside of customizations, I'm going to add that extension for Java that we installed earlier. So by adding this VS Code customization, we add this extension, and this extension is that VS Code Java pack. So now this is finished, except we have this red squiggly. This is just because I didn't add a comma after the last option here. So now we're good to go, and we can rebuild the container. The quickest path to doing this is hitting Control-Shift-P to open up the command palette, and then typing rebuild, and then hitting enter. It then asks you if you're sure that you want to rebuild, and I do, and I also want to fully rebuild because I want to clear all of the images and things that were there before. So what is nice is if we do encounter an error with the configuration, it will actually run in recovery mode, allowing us to change the configuration to what we need it to be so that there isn't an error anymore. It prompts us with this, allowing us to view the creation log so that we can see what our issue is. It looks like in our Android SDK, we were selecting some Java home that was pointing to an invalid directory. So it looks like the Java home issue was actually caused by this version being none and not selecting an actual version. So I selected 21 since that's the version that we're using for the container. So now that my Codespace is up and running, I can type in java-version, and now we can see that we have version 21 instead of version 11 that we had before. We also should have that extension for Java installed. So if we go to the extensions over here on the left-hand side, we can see that extension pack for Java has been installed on this Codespace. Let's just make sure that Maven is actually working. If we type Maven install, we get the log of actually doing the installation of all of the dependencies and everything else and building the application. And we get this build success. And now in our target directory, we have all of the information that we are expected to see for this Maven project. So now if we hit F5, it then asks us run debug. Are you sure? Do you want to run it in standard? And yes, we do want to run it in standard mode. So now it opens up the project, runs all the necessary downloads that it needs, and runs the project. And we can see that we have this hello world and then another line. So now that we've set up, configured, and ran the application, what should we do next? We should actually commit the changes that we made to devcontainer.json. So if we go to our source control over here on the left, we can then type in a message. I'll say create a dev container, and then I'll hit commit. Of course, I forgot to stage all of my changes, and I want to say yes. I want to stage them and then commit them. Now we're not quite done yet. We need to sync the changes so that it gets to our repository. Just making sure that you want to sync the changes to the Codespace, and yeah, we do. So now that we're all synced up, our repository should have the changes that we need. Now, how do we get out of this Codespace without just doing the obvious of closing out of the tab? Well, we can do so by going in the bottom left and clicking on our Codespace. It opens up the command palette. And from here, we can scroll down and go to remote repository. Now it installs an extension onto this Codespace. And over here on the left, you'll have this remote explorer. If we click on it, we can see all of our code spaces and some information about them. And there's this little button right next to it that says disconnect. When we click this, it will take us out of this code space. So once we disconnect, we get taken to a page that lists all of our code spaces, and we can see all of the ones that we've created. And from here, it's just a matter of getting back to the repository. So now that we're back at the repository, say we want to reuse that code space, go back in and start working. We can click on the green button, code button here, and inside of here is the code space that we created. So we can click on organic guacamole that I have created, and we get taken directly to our code space already running. And with that, that is how you create and configure a code space for Java and Maven development.